Welcome to our evening keynote address and dinner. Thank you once again for participating in the third American Politics and Government Faculty Summit at ISI. Really, the fundamental purpose of ISI at this point in our history is to re-enchant the civilizational imagination of the West. To re-enchant the civilizational imagination of the West. If I could have your attention. If I could have your attention. Excuse me. To re-enchant the civilizational imagination of the West. That is ISI's aim and contribution towards this task of saving and restoring our Western heritage and our American civilization. And the way that that really happens is through the encounter that young students have with professors on their college campus. This historically has been the relationship and the bond that has formed great men and women throughout history, and that is what we exist to support on college campuses, and you are truly the linchpin to make that happen. So this whole weekend should really be about empowering you to do what you do best on your college campus. And so once again, I will make another plug to go to isi.org, and if you click on the faculty tab, you'll see a page that says Join ISI's Faculty Community, and there's a button that says Apply for a Grant. So we would encourage you to apply for a grant, host a forum, or pitch us some of your other creative ideas for what you would like to do on your campus. We're open to hearing those ideas and partnering with you to re-enchant the civilizational imagination of the West. Tonight we have a distinct privilege of hearing from one of the greatest American journalists, Christopher Caldwell. Christopher is a contributing writer for the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. He's a contributing editor for the Claremont Review of Books and a member of the editorial committee of the French quarterly Commentaire. And he's also the author of two books, both of which were ahead of their time. The first one, Reflections on the Revolution in Europe, Immigration, Islam, and the West, which was published in 2009. People thought it was too pessimistic at the time. Turned out to be quite prophetic. And then his other book, The Age of Entitlement, America Since the 60s, which examined in particular kind of the legacy of the civil rights legislation, was actually published in February of 2020. So once again, sort of ahead of his time in his analysis of American culture. He was also formerly a senior editor of the Weekly Standard and a columnist for the Financial Times. So please join me in welcoming tonight's keynote, Christopher Caldwell.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Johnny. Well, I'm so happy to be here, and thank you all for having me. It's lovely. I'd like to talk tonight about what looks to me like the lurch that society is about to take into what I'll call a post-baby boom world. Johnny mentioned a book that I'd written 5 years ago, The Age of Entitlement, which wound up being a history of the United States, as sort of a political history since, between the assassination of John F. Kennedy and the rise of Donald Trump. The way I started thinking about that book was I started thinking I would want to write a book about the baby boom generation in power. When people talk about the baby boom, they tend to focus on the most picturesque parts of it. That is, the Mouseketeers and the newness of black and white television in the 1950s, and then Woodstock and like naked people smoking dope and that sort of thing. But actually, I think that this generation, this baby boom generation, the largest generation that the country has ever produced, really had its effect on the country and really will have marked the country by what it did when they were adults. And so when I wrote the book, There was a lot about the baby boom in it. The baby boom generation still held control, and it still does now. I think the baby boom is still in control of society, but barely. And it seems that something is really about to happen. There are signs of a real generational rupture ahead of us. And I just think of the replacement of Trump-Pence by Trump-Vance and what that means. I think of the assassination of Charlie Kirk and the reaction to it, which is something that took place outside the purview and sort of really outside of the, let's say, outside of the sort of the usual media language of the baby boom generation. It took place in a new language, but we can talk about that a little later on. There's the rise of Zoran Mamdani in New York and his mayoral campaign, which is bringing up all sorts of issues that have really never even been broached, perhaps for good reason. Anyway, so I'll talk about, I'd like to talk about the cultural hold of the baby boom on this country, but first I'd like to talk a little bit about the material conditions that created that cultural hold and why the baby boom, it wound up being what it was. The baby boom, as you probably know, is the group of people who were born between 1946 and 1964. It's slightly arbitrary, but it's a good, these are the post-war babies. There are about 75 million of them. And by the time they were all born in 1964, the country had just under 200 million people. So that's a tremendous proportion of the country. That's more than a third of the country. And for the rest of their days until now, they would constitute this giant immovable wodge, if I can use a Briticism, in the middle of the American sociological landscape. They occupied this, they were roughly the same amount of people, enhanced a little bit by immigration and people of that era who became citizens, until about 2010. And then they began to decline, slowly at first, but it's beginning to accelerate. And now the baby boomers are dying at the rate of about 1.8 million a year, and that number is rising. And so now they're down to about 70 million in a much larger country. They've gone from being about a third to being about a fifth of the country. Still, they are so influential, and the main reason is their influence at the ballot box, okay? The baby boomers started voting in the 1968 elections because we had a 21-year-old voting age. But by 1980, we had switched the voting age to 18. Almost all the baby boomers were in the electorate. They were then over 40%. But in 1982, they're 43%, and that is where they stay into this century, okay? So this is a generation that's casting over 40% of the votes in the country. Now, on certain issues about like the size of government, what to do about communism, they're divided and polarized. But there are other issues, mostly cultural issues, that are not really that ideological. They have much more to do with like how old you are and what relationship you're in with your life cycle, let's say. So in the 1980s, in the 70s and 80s, when the baby boomers were mostly young, they were voting for liberal rules on sex. And that's what they liked then. As we got into the 80s and 90s, all right, the country was oriented around work. It was oriented around making work easier and allowing you to keep more of your money. And now, because the baby boomers are of a certain age, it's oriented around protection of investments. So the baby boomers have sort of shaped the entire country in their in their image in a way. Now, this too is changing. The baby boomers are not only starting to die, but there are younger generations that are bigger. The country's bigger, and they now, in the last election, they passed below 30% of the electorate. They cast 32% of the votes because they turn out more. But their influence is through elections is waning. I'd like to say a little word about the influence they've had through the avenue of the economy. Okay, the baby boomers roughly entered the workforce a little earlier than they entered the electorate, let's say in 1964. By the Reagan administration in the 1980s, they were over half the workforce. And in 1990, in the 1990 census, they're 54% of the workforce. And that is a very interesting moment for that to be true, because that's when the Berlin Wall fell and the United States got to rewrite all the rules of the global economy for everyone, and the entire world kind of converged on the American way of doing business. At that point, the boomers were between 25 and 43 years old, and they were the energetic people who built all these global institutions. They're now retiring, a lot of them. They're now the baby boom now only makes up 15% of the workforce. That seems low, but actually it's high. If they'd retired at the rate of earlier generations, it would be lower than that. Still, they're shrinking. Okay, now this is the core of the baby boom's. This is the heart of the baby boom power, and it's the foundation of baby boom culture. So what is baby boom culture? I'd like to argue tonight that there's basically an account of American history, a story of American history that's like the baby boom story, and I think it's probably the one that you got in school. And what is this story? Well, first of all, I'd say that the power of the baby boom is very narrowly held. It's not like this whole group from 1946 to 1964 didn't sort of like convene and decide what their culture would be once they all got old enough. Basically, demographers and civic leaders totally understood what was happening with the baby boom by the late 40s. And the country began frantically investing in schools and other institutions and talking about how to introduce this big new generation into the country. So they were really, the baby boom generation they were anticipated, okay? And so almost immediately after the first baby boomers got into society and became adults, they became like the representatives of youth. And they were like crowned the representatives of youth as soon as they were there. So basically, by the time these people born in 1946, 47, and 48 were in society, society was done with youth. These were like the bosses forever. So it's not a coincidence, I think, that there's only 1 year in American history in which 3 presidents were born, and it's 1946. Basically, the representatives of this generation were totally in place by 1970, or at the very least by the midterm elections of 1974, the post-Watergate elections that brought so many young people in. So what do these people think? I would go with the old saying that's often attributed to Napoleon, although he said many things like this, but never said exactly this. He said, in order to figure out what a man is, you have to know what was happening in the world when he was 20. Okay? So what were these people, what was the set of values that you were gaining in the United States in 20 years after 1946, or in the late 60s? I would say the first thing of all is civil rights. Civil rights was defined as the great moral conflict in American history. And something was sort of inverted in this. The American race problem was always understood as a problem in delivering freedom, as a constitutional problem, is one of the aspects to our constitutional problem of freedom. I would say that after the 60s, people came to understand freedom as an aspect of the race problem. They sort of like reversed the polarity on that. The other thing in the late 60s was World War II. Looking back on that, World War II was, of course, the great American victory, and there are two things that I think can be said about it. One is that it was a triumph of, let's say, American expertise, and so it was a great invitation to hubris. The other is that it was open to being interpreted racially. Another thing about the late 1960s was Vietnam. What I find most interesting about Vietnam, in retrospect, is that it created a kind of generational civil war among people of draft age, with people in elite universities trying to avoid service, and people who were unable to avoid service necessarily arguing that the war in which they were fighting and dying was a worthwhile war, or at least a sacred citizenly duty, okay? And what happened after the retreat from Vietnam? And this is not the same as arguing that it was a wise idea to go to war in Vietnam. But what happened after the retreat from Vietnam is that the elite side of this youth civil war felt itself vindicated. They said, see, we were right. We knew better than the people who were sending you off to Vietnam. And I think that that had an that favored a certain kind of, let's say managerial liberalism as time went on. I just want to say, so in this system, liberals were hegemonic. Progressives were hegemonic, and it's not to say there was no disagreement in it. I mean, there were always people who argued that the state that had been built up to serve the Great Society was too big, as they did under Reaganism, or that taxes were too high, or that some of the costs of some of the new programs of civil rights had gone too far. But these were all minor heresies. And I think that the general narrative of what politics was about in the baby boom was uncontested by either party. And furthermore, there seemed no prospect of generational change because the baby boom generation was just so big. And one of the things that we tend to talk about today, that I think that runs through a lot of people's heads today, is how some of this stuff that people were taught, how could they believe it? What were they thinking? Why were people so inclined to just nod and accept it when people talked about stuff like gender fluidity? Why wasn't there more pushback? And the short answer is that there was political correctness. But political correctness drew its power from the fact that the baby boom was just electorally and economically invincible. And it wasn't that the young people were really indoctrinated. It was that they perceived the preponderance of this generation. And so I would say that you got the first harbinger that this world was collapsing. That is, that it was losing the material bases of its power with the election of Donald Trump in 2016. And at that point, there's sort of like, it really begins to become worth measuring how strong is the baby boom and how strong is the post-baby boom. Now, one of the things that makes this really interesting is that these two groups are almost hermetically sealed off from each other. They don't communicate particularly well. They don't have a common system of communication. And what accounts for this lack of communication? Well, I'd say first is they have different interests, okay? I mean, when you talk about, inherited money, let's just say the interests of the median 70-year-old are so different from those of the median 30-year-old that it's almost not worth talking. The second thing is that there's just a technological sea change now that makes it really hard for people to communicate between, like baby boomers and post-baby booms. There's much less transmission of culture from parents to children than there was a generation ago. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. It does happen. But there's a lot of parents that I talk to who say, like, I never ever talked to my children about sex. And they seem to know what's going on. And a lot of this stuff, no, but I mean, a lot of this stuff came through phones. And just the act of meeting your children's friends, which everyone did when the only way to your child was either through the front door or through the phone that you could pick up. Every parent could know all the names of all his friends. And that's just not true now. So a funny thing is going on. People talk about how we live under surveillance capitalism or a surveillance society, but in fact, the classic surveillors of all human history, that is parents, have less power to surveil than they've ever had. I mean, all the surveillance we're talking about comes from the state. And now there's a third reason why I think that the boomers and the post-boomers have a hard time communicating, and that's that naturally the post-boomers have come up with different myths. What are these myths? Well, I'll ask you to tell me what they are after the dinner, if you're young enough to have expertise on it. But I would just say, like, what is the core value for young people today? I mean, sort of for let's say people in their early 30s today, or in their 30s in generally. I would follow, like, it's not the equivalent of what civil rights was for boomers. I would say, if you take the Napoleon rule of seeing what people were thinking when they were 20, I would say there are two candidates for things that had a big effect on young people. And I would say one is the Iraq War, and the other is the financial crash of 2008. And I know that these things antedated a lot of, kids coming to political consciousness. If you're, I know these things like the Iraq War started 22 years ago. So if you're now 30, it happened when you were 8. But the shadow this cast over people's lives was extraordinary. And I think that what they both did was they convinced young people that a lot of the really fundamental stuff that grown-ups were telling them was a fraud. And one of the things that was a fraud was this sort of like investment economy, which seems to be propped up by deficit spending. And, one of these days, the whole thing's going to blow up, and it's all, what. This is, by the way, this is worse in countries like the United Kingdom, where there's no growth, okay? Where there's been like no growth at all, zero since the financial crisis. And then people are really angry and really hot, okay? But the other thing is, people really distrusted foreign policy. And I don't know that there's anything in this country. I was very interested in the speech that Pete Hegseth gave the other day about de-wokeifying the military. For the most part, I think it was an excellent speech, and I wrote a column about it. But there's a deeper problem that we have, which is that I don't know almost anything that you could convince a majority of Americans to fight a war on, to fight a war about. I'd say so, but so when I think about these things, I'm trying to measure the difference between this young generation and this old generation. And there are basically two things, I think, where the young generation is really at odds with the older one. And I think they're kind of instructive. One is the popularity of socialism among people in their 20s, where if you poll them, an extremely large percentage, including sometimes a majority in some cases, say they're socialists. The other is Israel. Israel is young people in their 20s have a totally different view of Israel than older people. Although I don't think that this sends quite the message that we think it does. If you ask people over 65 who they support in the Israel-Palestine conflict, they say Israel by 65-6. If you ask people between 20 and 30 who they support, they say Palestine by 28-20. But I'd like you to pay close attention to that number, because I think this is the issue on which the generations differ most. And actually, it's the older generation that is sort of fixed in its view on the subject. If you look at that younger generation number on Israel-Palestine, which I repeat is the single issue on which they differ most from their elders, much more than on climate change, which is about 20, they differ by about 20%, or on abortion, which is actually not a very big difference at all. If you look at this, 28% for Palestine, 20% for Israel, and then 50% are just like, that's an indication that what's going on is there's no uprising, there's no upwelling of a new view of the Middle East conflict. What there is a kind of a fading away of baby boom certitudes. And so we don't, the curious thing about the baby boom, the post-baby boom ideology, is that we don't really have a clear idea of what this ideology is, what this generation is for, as opposed to just being different from baby boomers. Particularly on the left, I would say. But but we can tell, I think, that that we are on the verge of a lurch to something different. There are a couple of, I don't really think I can tell you what it's going to be, but there are a couple of elements of that I think are going to be interesting. One is, it's going to be an enormous change in the style of culture. We are in a sort of like a temple of learning here, and it's really thrilling to be here. And so there are places where the transmission of culture in the old sense can continue as it did. But, baby boomers are very different culturally. Baby boomers were all went to high school, whether they were born in 1946 or 1964, at high schools that offered Latin and probably German. And that's like every public high school in the country. Another interesting element of this, though, I think will be the radicalizing effect of the instability of social security, which looks like a rather unstable system that is being protected by an invincible electoral bloc. And I would say that is one of those things where there's going to be a straw that breaks the camel's back, or a different, I'm trying to think of the right metaphor, as that bloc that is receiving Social Security benefits falls below a certain threshold, the moment it falls below a certain threshold, the whole thing is going to flip, and it's going to lose all legitimacy. It's going to be like the people who are then getting Social Security are going to be like people who are sort of on a seesaw with a fat person on the other end. And they're like way up in the air, and he gets off and down they go. But I think it's going to be there's the optimistic way of looking at it is just to say, this problem of entitlement, people don't like it when I call it Social Security entitlement, but this problem of paying for the state is going to get a lot more, it's going to get easier. It's going to get easier to envision once the generations change. Now, I think an interesting thing about this moment is we think that we've had polarization before, both generational and ideological. I mean, look at the 1960s. There was the generation gap and off the pigs and stuff like that. But actually, it's much tougher today, because in the 1960s, the generational and the ideological polarizations were basically the same gap. And today, there's something I think much more complicated. You have the left and the right gap, but then you have the older and the younger gap. And it's, basically in the old, even if you confine yourself to the right, or if you confine yourself to the left, there are a lot of people who don't understand the younger people who hold the ideology that they're supposed to hold. And that's what I think is killing the Democrats now. Because Republicans, whether you like Trump's ideology or not, have this Trumpian project that both the young people and the older people are working on. The baby boomers are really not sure whether there's any Zoran Mamdani project worth following. And they're not sure they're on board with it. So, I mean, an example, well, anyway, I think that we're about to find out a whole lot. There's one optical illusion which I think that we're all susceptible to, which I would call the illusion of the kind of demographic on-deck circle, which is like, we think that, the baby boomers are going and now it's Gen X's turn. It's like, your president used to be, like 75 years old, and now I'll be 65 years old. But it's not going to work that way. Generational succession is not fair, and it's not socialist. It's not like it's not everyone gets their turn. It's like, it's much more like monarchic succession than it isn't. I mean, like in England, okay, you had Queen Elizabeth was crowned when she was 25 years old, and she was queen for 70 years. And by the time she died, Prince Charles, but now King Charles, was well into his 70s. So he's not going to get the same. He's not going to get the same reign that she got, and it's that way with us. The people who succeed, the baby boomers, are not going to be the people who are 60, 50, 40. We're too small. It's too small a generation, and I think we have maybe too much acquired the habit of being sidekicks and lackeys to the baby boomers. What's more likely to happen is that the power in society and the power to sort of shape the culture is going to lurch to the next big, let's just say, demographic point of concentration, which, as far as I can tell, is somewhere in the early 30s, people who are in the early 30s. And what makes me think that is AOC, Zoran Mamdani, and, God rest his soul, Charlie Kirk. I mean, there seems to be something going on there. All three of them would have been considered plausible presidential candidates in 2028, although Mamdani, I'm sorry, is too young. But now I don't know if this generational transfer that we're talking about is going to work out by 2028, but I tend to think it will, and something is going to happen. Thank you very much. Okay, good. So what do you want?
Feel free to sit down.
Okay, good.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Christopher. Very insightful talk. I'm wondering. I'm only going to ask actually one question, and I just want to get it to the audience because I'm sure you've got a lot to ask Chris. I'm curious. What do you think is the best virtue of the baby boomers? You've got a lot of criticism. What's their greatest virtue? And then also, what do you most, when you sort of interact with kind of young conservatives, Gen Z, millennial, what would you say you're most hopeful about, or that you see in them that you think, yeah, this kind of lurch or this kind of reset to the younger generation will be, welcome from your.
Oh, that's something I maybe wish I'd given a little more thought to before I came up here. I would say the thing that I got, I was educated in the shadow of like all these 1960s reforms, and I went through school in the 1970s, and then through college in the 1980s, and all this stuff about like, hey man, don't study so hard, just go on the sofa and read a book and stuff like. It actually all worked out very well for me, and but I really like it really it isn't for everybody, but there was a kind of there's an easygoingness and a tolerance among 1960s people, which is a really powerful virtue. And I don't think that you can have something like, you can get the full value out of an institution like the free market if you're not actually committed to saying, well, okay, let that guy do what he does. I mean, I think that we all, rules are helpful too, but the tolerance of the 60s is a great virtue. Younger people, I would know this much better if I had managed to unlock the code on my children's iPhones, but I'm very impressed by their energy and their directness and their ability to dig their way out from under a lot of garbage that was dumped on them. I mean, it's taken. Maybe it's just that they have sources of information, they have more sources of information that we didn't have growing up, and they've been fortified by it. But there's some sort of ability to actually cut through a lot of just extraneous stuff that we didn't have to deal with, and we could never have cut through.